Hey 3D MJers, this is Andrea Valdez and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. Today I'm talking to Eric Helms and Brad Loomis all about training volume. We honestly couldn't freaking believe we hadn't given this topic its own episode yet, but we were inspired by an Instagram post to do so and we're really glad it happened. So, side note, if you don't already follow us there on the IGs, our screen name is at Team3DMJ, no spaces, all one word, and we get a lot of ideas and topics there from the comment section, so please don't be shy about it. Anyways, a couple weeks ago, we shared a post on our team account that Steve Hall from Revive Stronger and the Revive Stronger podcast had created. So it was essentially a comparison of training volumes. There were stage shots of Jeff Alberts on the far left, Alberto Nunez in the middle, and Doug Miller on the far right, looking all shredded and impressive along a continuum of different training styles and volume amounts within their respective programs. So Jeff being, or in this graphic, Jeff being the example of lower, Alberto moderate, and Doug being high. And again, all of them looking impressive like the professionals that they are. And also, Steve included a great discussion and context around this image underneath the post, but it was hard to ignore the repeated responses that we got in our comments and DMs. So quite a few people asked the big question of, okay, cool, but how much training volume should I be doing? Or maybe said differently, how do I know if I'm someone who needs to train like Jeff or Alberto or Doug? Hence, this episode was born. So you'll hear Brad and Eric discuss different ways of tracking volume, how we kind of handle a beginner's dosing versus an experienced athlete or experienced trainee, whether we lower, keep, or increase volume when we start up a new athlete to our roster. We also go over tracking differences between bodybuilders and powerlifters, tracking differences between compounds and isolation movements, and a whole lot more. So, again, thanks if you follow us or Revive Stronger, whatever, on Instagram. Thank you for reaching out. If you ever have questions or topics for us, that's always a great place to leave them, is on Instagram. And then for longer or more specific questions, you can always deliver those to us at 3dmusclejourney.com/QA. So really hope you guys like this. Thanks for the suggestions and the questions. Let's go ahead and dive into it. Here's our episode all about training volume considerations with Brad Loomis and Eric Helms. So, Eric, in the muscle and strength pyramids, which 2015? No, I think 2014 or 15 when you put the videos up first before the books.
The videos?
Yeah.
The training or nutrition?
The training.
2015.
2015, okay. Dang, same year as the books. We cranked that thing out.
Yeah, it was the very beginning of 2015.
Yeah, and then the books came out at the very end.
Training videos, I believe.
Okay, so in there, you gave some general volume recommendations for hypertrophy and strength. And I guess I want to ask, like, one, what were those? If you want to just recap, I won't take you 2 seconds. But then, do you think that those fully encompass, like, the goals that everyone should be reaching to, or should that still be a general guideline, or do you think saying that as a general guideline is sort of confusing and leaves out some other things?
I think if you're going to give those specific numbers, you really need to express in some way that there's going to be amount of individual variation that goes far beyond, like, the range. Like, if you were just to make an Instagram post and be like, hey, do, 10 to 12 sets per muscle group. It'd be like, and some people might need 6 and some people might need 20. It's like, it's not a useful thing to do,
Yeah.
So anyway, to answer your questions, the original muscle and strength pyramid guidelines were based on a 2007 systematic review by Wernbaum, where they looked at all of the different rates of muscle growth in a bunch of different studies, using traditional resistance training. This is also in the bicep and quad, so this is upper body and lower body. It fell that the peak amount of muscle growth rate fell between 40 to 70 repetitions per muscle group in kind of the typical hypertrophy range, done 2 to 3 times per week. So that could be anywhere from 80 to 210 repetitions per muscle group. However, I would say that now that we have better data and better ways of expressing volume, in my opinion, that's a rather outdated recommendation, because if you're doing like super high reps, you can get there really easily, but it will not probably be enough volume because so many of those initial reps in a high rep set are just generating fatigue to make the following volume more effective, if that makes sense. So like if you do a set of 40, the first 15 reps don't really do much except for helping get to the point where the reps start counting, you know? Right. So anyway, probably a better way to look at it is more recent meta-analytic data from Ralston. There's a meta-analysis on strength, and then Schoenfeld has done one with some colleagues on hypertrophy, and we're looking probably around like the 10 plus hard sets per muscle group or per movement. And that's the plus is like, oh, we don't have enough studies on very high volumes. So that's still a big range, you know. That's probably anywhere from like 10 to 20 for most people in most situations from what we've seen in our, you know, practice. So I think it's only useful if you don't have prior data, and if you're relatively new, and just to help people out a little bit, like those 10 plus sets could be in any rep range so long as they're like 6 or higher, and those are hard sets. When you start looking at like the 1 to 5 rep range, you'll probably need more sets to get the same amount of stimulus, because there's just not enough actual time contracting. Even though all those reps are very effective, it's not enough.
Gotcha. I'm going to unwrap a lot of what you just said because it was awesome, but it was a lot. I'm going to go backwards.
And we'll see you next time on the 3D Muscle Journey podcast.
So to go backwards, right, to clarify all of that for someone who's maybe not familiar with our podcast or super versed in this. So when we say training volume, what most people think of it, and I think still what most people think is like, okay, reps times sets times weight.
Times load.
Right, okay, so load either kgs or pounds or whatever. And that's how the first thing that you talked about was what we first talked about in the pyramids. And then what you're saying is not the only other way, but another way to calculate that would be hard sets.
So would it be useful for me to talk about the problems with tonnage, the problems with reps, and then the problems with sets? And then what probably makes the best sense for the way to count it?
Sure.
Okay.
That would be great.
So tonnage can be useful, but I think largely only within the same person, right? And the reason why is because if you take an extremely high-level lifter who is, let's say, a 140 kilo male, let's say Ray Williams, compared to Susie Hartwood-Gary, right? So we've got a 52 kg female and a super heavy male. Just to get the same amount of tonnage from one rep, Susie's going to have to do like 3 reps on her squat, even though both of them are arguably some of the best squatters in the world in their respective division and sex. So obviously the tonnage is going to be different, right? However, if Susie or Ray looks at their own training and they track changes in tonnage, they're always comparing themselves to just how they were a little while ago. And given that they're at the top of their game, they're probably not making massive changes in their strength. The sets times reps times load portion is going to be relatively fixed. So changes in tonnage are going to reflect doing more repetitions or doing large changes. More repetitions or more sets. Small changes could reflect increases in load. So it might be a useful metric within an individual to see, am I doing more? But it doesn't give a lot of. Go ahead.
Sorry, and then to account for that, you can always do like relative. So the same thing, but you'd be timing it by percentage, not the actual weight.
Yeah,
like because you were saying, because Susie needs to do 3 reps at 333 pounds to do Ray Williams 1,000 or whatever.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that's a great point. Is you can multiply that sets times reps times percentage 1RM to get an arbitrary number of units of volume that is much more comparable across individuals, but probably should only be specific to a lift. You know, like some lifts you don't perform the same range of motion. Some lifts, you don't really perform the eccentric very much. So comparing their sets times reps times relative load even is not a great comparison. Like I wouldn't compare someone with monkey arms doing sumo deadlifts, their relative volume, to them doing a squat. If they happen to have like long femurs and a long distance to travel, and they were definitely doing the eccentrics, they had to, versus dropping their deadlifts. Like that's going to provide different levels of stress and stimulus. But yeah, relative volume gets around a lot of those problems. And that's probably something you could look at in different individuals decently well, but it's really hard to conceptualize what that means. And it's hard to tell someone, yeah, just do 800 units of relative volume on each lift. They're like, okay, I don't know what that means. Yeah. And I think I kind of went over what the issue with this total reps is that you don't know how effective each one of those repetitions was. That's why, as simple as it is, looking at hard sets in the 6+ rep range is a useful way to compare. Because if you do a hard set of 6, let's say that's an RPE 7 or higher, you're pretty much going to have each one of those reps being pretty damn effective. That's going to be with your, let's say it's a 7 RPE, so you could have done 9 reps. That's with roughly like your 75 to 80% of 1RM. That means it's doing something from the start. So all 6 of those reps are going to have a pretty fair amount of stimulus, and as you get towards the end, it's going to be a little higher. And if you compare that to a set of 20, yeah, those first 10 reps aren't that hard, and then they start to get hard. So they're not a lot of stimulus, and then end up looking at an aggregate based on the best data we have. A set of 20 at a 7 to 10 RPE compared to a set of 6 at a 7 to 10 RPE are probably going to do about the same thing in terms of like all else being equal, the hypertrophy stimulus for the average person. So that's why it can be useful to just look at hard sets.
Okay. Brad, can you stop us and come in and checkpoint and did we miss anything there? Does that all make sense? Does it flow? Do you have any questions?
I mean, yes and no. I think there's a big arena that we need to address, and that's your volume in context to a lifter's career, right? Because we're kind of, at least I feel like we're kind of talking about and throwing out kind of maybe initial recommendations for folks, right? Mm-hmm. But really, to be honest with you, how many of those folks do we really truly work with? I don't know that I've worked with any first-timers for a long time.
But they could be listening. So maybe we should,
for sure.
So maybe we should, like Eric kind of mentioned at the beginning, he's like, these recommendations are because we have to make some roundabout. Because someone has to have some good starting point.
Sure, yeah.
I was saying there's people like that don't have a starting point. And then, like you said, it's really common that you have people that have been lifting for years that have never calculated their training volume or don't track it really. Or
well, they never thought about it in that context.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe they're like, this is going up over time, but they don't really, that's all they know is like, this lift, I used to do 50 and now I do 60. Like,
They often won't know why something worked or didn't. Like, they did this really high volume program, high frequency, and they switched to this low volume, high intensity program, and they ascribed the effects that they experienced just based on being related to that thing versus the pieces of it that make up its stimulus,
Would you argue that knowing this stuff isn't even important for some people?
No, I think you need to have kind of a basic level of understanding of how much you're doing. You can get that experientially just from like, oh wow, I tried this program and it's really easy. I'm not in there very much, and compared to what I was doing, it just doesn't seem hard enough. And you switch. But if you never really fully understand why certain programs work, then you're probably going to waste a lot of time trying things. And I do mean waste, because if you understand the basic principles that a program is built on, then that you have the ability to test how that system works for you. And then likely which other systems might not work or might work. Like if you just did,
you'll have a filter.
Small up junior. Exactly. Like if you just did small up junior for bench and it didn't work, and then someone recommends Shiko for bench, you'd go, I did something really similar to that already. I don't know if that's going to be effective for me.
Gotcha.
But if you don't know the difference, you're just like, sweet. So is Shiko jacked?
Does it work? Oh, it worked for you. It will work for me. Yeah. Okay. So Brad, elaborate on what you're saying. Like, we don't have a lot of people generally that are complete noobs. And what other considerations were you thinking that we need to go into?
Well, like I was saying, a lot of our folks, they've got a good amount of training experience. Sometimes it's a year, which I think is sometimes considered as, maybe at most a novice, could be a beginner, if they haven't done anything really structured. But I'd say probably average, we'll say 3.5, 4 years of training experience, right? And I think Berto put up a really good post or made an Instagram story on sometimes he can tell how good a person's physique is going to be just judging by how their training looks in the application. If they outline what their training is in the application, be like, he can tell. He can kind of look at their training and go, well, this guy's going to have a good physique. And then, of course, he looks at the pictures and either, yeah, sure enough, he does, or, he doesn't. Or I should say he or she does or doesn't. And so, yeah, when evaluating volume, in an athlete, I kind of try to get as much as I can, context. If I see their training and then I compare that to their pictures, and how long that they've been at it, I'm going to pretty much make an opinion at that point, which we'll elaborate on, obviously, when we talk. As to how that is working. I'll either say, okay, you know what, look at this person's physique. What they're doing is working. And so I may just fine tune things a little bit. Maybe if their goal now is a little bit different and it's less physique and more strength or maybe more performance or something like that, I'm going to say, well, we're going to kind of tune things a little bit toward that, but we're not going to make a whole lot of changes to volume. If they want to, say, change the strength, maybe we'll bring volume down a little bit, but I'm not going to slash it in half, just for the sake of having them lift heavier. And then likewise, if I see somebody who's been, say, lifting for 4 or 5 years and their physique really doesn't show that, all other things taken into consideration, they're eating enough, they're getting enough rest, they're not, doing things that sometimes we can see in their application that would help limit, their results from their program. I'm going to say, yeah, you know what? We probably do need to increase your volume. We probably do need to make changes that get you more jacked, in line with whatever their goals are. If that is to get jacked, or so many times we see, to maximize my muscular potential. That's kind of their big goal that I see almost universally. And so, yeah, if I can tell that they've been kind of spinning their wheels a little bit, when we talk, I'm going to say, okay, well, you know what, we probably need to make a change in volume, however it is that we quantify that by sets or repetitions or how many hard sets or, et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of what I was alluding to, was when you get past that initial recommendation, that, that scientific baseline of, okay, here's where we start. Once you get that and you start building on that, then it becomes more of a gut feeling, I guess you might say, of we need to go up, we need to go down, we need to go heavier, etc.
An informed, intuitive process of adjusting what they're doing based on their start, whether or not they're progressing currently, whether or not things match up, whether it looks low or high to start. Yeah, totally. And I think, Brad, you brought up some really good things. It's really important to understand that when you look at a meta-analysis, it's giving you a fixed value of the statistically generated peak amount of volume associated with gains that we have to research in the people we have to research it on, which means who are the people being analyzed? Well, 90% of them are untrained, and the other 10% are what we would consider like more of our novice clientele. Also, I would even go as far to say 95 to 100% of the data being meta-analyzed, people training to failure. So that means if anything, the volume recommendations are going to be on the lower end. We don't have studies on the highest amount. We're looking at the peak rates of growth in people who need very little volume, and we're looking at the peak rates of growth when the intensity is maxed out on each one of those sets in terms of intensity of effort. So how much volume would they need if they'd been training for 5 years, and if they were not training to failure and each set was maximally effective but they could recover and do more, and if and what do they do over time are all questions that just simply can't be answered by that information. So I would 100% agree with Brad that it's the situations where you don't know where to start. This is useful information. But if you have been started for a while and have data prior, and it has either worked or not, that might be more useful information than this alone.
Yeah. So it almost like not goes out the window, but it is. It's not irrelevant, but if you're somewhere in, like if Brad gets an application and it's all there, and they say I've been doing this program for 6 months without missing a day, and which is not likely, but they're saying like I've been doing this without wavering for 6 months. Brad knows how much volume they're doing, so Eric's thing from the pyramids is actually kind of irrelevant, right? Because within this person, this is what matters. Whether they're doing half of that or double of that, it's this that's their data set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, because No, you go, Eric.
I was just going to say, yeah, it can be useful in that if you really have never been exposed to scientific literature before and you've just been following insert name of program, if you want to know, like, how does this compare to what, has shown values in studies? And if you're wildly different than that, that might tell you something. Like if you were doing 30 sets per body part per week, and you are not a very high-level strength athlete or bodybuilder,
wow.
Or you're not training for volume, like I could see maybe like certain phases of CrossFit training emphasizing strength training where it's done to accumulate like your work capacity with weights. Maybe you would do that, but it's not really like curls and shit. It's very different.
Yeah.
Then yeah, but outside of odd cases, if you're a bodybuilder or a strength athlete and you're doing like 30 hard sets per muscle group or movement, and you're not like at the top of the world, and like that's what you've had to do to get there, then that's probably inappropriate. Likewise, if you're doing like 3 sets per week, and you're on one of those ultra minimalist, and this is probably more common, like you train one movement 3 times a week, full body, because somebody put like Arthur Jones stuff in your hands early or something like that, or it's just ultra minimalist, like I do overhead press on one day, and then I do deadlift on another, and then squats, and then I just do chins, nothing else. Like, then that's fine. But once that stops working, we know the answer.
Yeah.
You've been playing with the lowest possible volume for so long, it might be time to do something a little more voluminous.
Okay, so what you're doing, we know matters way more than the general recommendations, but the general recommendations are good. I guess things to weigh yourself against.
Reference material, yeah.
There you go. That's the word. Okay. What are, like when you say, I guess what's the point of knowing this, I guess, as far as, like how would we know when we have hit a good spot, if that makes sense? Y'all say, obviously we know if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Okay, well, if, and we all know we want to make progress, but what is the, I know you don't like the word optimal, but what would be a sweet spot? Like, what are characteristics of that?
That's a good question. And I think...
it changes over time, too.
That's very true.
Yeah.
I think if we're talking about people who've been in the gym a couple of years, like our average person who's been training for 3 years and is coming to us to optimize things, if they are progressing, it's probably pretty damn close to optimal. I think, again, when we're looking at that kind of tiered relationship, and these meta-analysis, they'd go, right, so 1 to 5 sets is inferior to, 1 to 4 sets is inferior to 5 to 9 is inferior to 10 plus. Each one of those steps has a faster rate of hypertrophy. although it's kind of diminishing returns, but it's still statistically significant. It's visible there in the data. I think the differences in those like the peaks in those amounts get much narrower once you've been well trained. Like for me, for example, if I'm training with inappropriately low volume, it's very obvious because nothing is happening. I have no measure of strength progress. And if I then bump up my volume and start to make progress a little bit, great. And if I do even more volume than that, even after a taper, I don't notice any faster rate of strength gain. You know what I'm saying? Like I haven't seen, like overreaching certainly works, or going through a period of as much volume as someone can handle. But it doesn't reliably produce faster gains in any way in the real world that I can tell than doing the amount of volume that was just producing measurable progress when you are relatively advanced at the intermediate stage or later. So if you're making progress, I'd say that's the biggest indicator. And then it's just a matter of, are you making progress on way more volume than you need to? Because that can happen too. And there are side effects to where your motivation to train goes down, you know, your quality of sleep is worse, your aches and pains are there, or you're injured relatively frequently. Like all of those things are not worth the increase in volume, I would say.
Do you have a system in which you find that out? So like you said, okay, I know with me, these are all the traits. When I manipulate when I'm in this way, this is what happens, and this is what I've seen. If you had someone who was maybe like mid-20s, they know they want to do this, but they don't want to waste time, but they have time. Like, do you have a favorite way of, and Brad too, you as a coach, of getting somebody new and being like, okay, so I have decided that I am going to maybe lower their volume first and then increase it over time and ask them these questions and see their physique as to when it stops progressing? Or I don't know if I'm asking that right. Like how did you find those out, and how do you, is there a better order in which you wish you had done that would have made it quicker? Did I ask that right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay.
What is the systematic approach we take to figure out what's the appropriate amount of volume for a client?
Yeah, that's totally what I said, right? No?
Well, it is, just with extra words.
That's what I meant, though. So if y'all can answer me that, or have a favorite way
Brad,
or
you
two.
want to go first?
I think, like I said before, we want to kind of assess, is what the person doing, is it working, and then I think a lot of times I put too much stock in this, but I like to look at their training age. What is their training age, and what is their level of skill? Because yeah, sure, if what have they been doing is working, and they're a beginner, maybe a novice, maybe we can squeeze a little bit more out of that. Maybe we can progress in a little faster method, adding more volume in a shorter period of time, hence getting the gains quicker. However, if we look at the flip side of that coin and we say, okay, that what this person's been doing is not working, and maybe they're kind of more the intermediate athlete who has just recently in the last few months not been able to add weight to the bar every 2-3 weeks, or add reps every month or whatever. Perhaps at that point we need to make a different kind of a shift, to where maybe we start progressing in a slower fashion. We bring down their volume initially, so that we can make more hard sets, and less easy sets, kind of hence driving strength, I guess you might say.
Right.
So that's the fun part of what we do, is that, not only do we want to figure out what's working, what's not working, what will work, what won't work, but then you have to add this dynamic of this continuum over a lifter's career, where things drastically change, like in that first 3 to 4 years, and then after that, they just get significantly harder, like forever, it seems like, you know. And then you add to that just the human factor. Goals change, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I just recently had 2 athletes that are like, you know what, training for hypertrophy was fun and all, you know, and it got me going. But, you know, I just want to be one of those dudes that just goes in the gym, throws 4 plates on the bar and trains with it. And, you know, that's a big change in goals. And so therefore that's going to be a big change in training approach.
Mm-hmm. I like too what you said. Is this working? And I guess working can definitely mean a lot of different things to different people. So working, of course, we have the whole thing, are we progressing or not? Yeah. But, like there's times in my life where I will do something stupid, get really excited about a certain goal. It works, but then I hurt myself. Or it works, but then, you know, I'm stressed and can't sleep. Or so I guess works would definitely depend. I don't know. I'm trying to think of like other things where like, yeah, I'm progressing, but this other thing. I'm progressing, but this other thing. What else would it be?
2 steps forward, but 3 steps backward kind of an approach.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess.
It worked for a little while, but now I'm broken.
Or if a prep comes in too, right? You know, if someone's going too hard in prep and now they're looking smaller and puny or way too quick or anyways, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Brad's on the money. There's a lot of considerations, or at least this is something I thought while he was saying it. There's a lot of considerations of what needs to be checked and manipulated before volume increases, you know? Mm-hmm. So, like, it bothers me every time I see, like, weak point guides on Instagram or YouTube or whatever, and it's almost always increase volume or frequency and maybe reduce volume on other body parts if they want to be edgy.
Oh, like lagging body part things. Was that what you mean by weak points?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, exactly. The solution is, you know,
it's more.
Just to do more, right? And it may very well be, but I think that's a dangerous recommendation just to throw out in the ether. And I would say it's even a dangerous assumption to make when you're looking at our clients who have been around for 3 years or 4 years to assume that everything they're doing is being done well. So we're talking about hard sets, and we're kind of making the assumption that A, the client is accurately assessing them as hard and not balls to the wall, or actually that was like a 5 RPE, not a 7. And 2, we're making the assumption that their form is actually safe and is something you'd want to throw more volume on. So I would say between, you know, my studies of RPE and my learnings through Jeff, just how often he will take a look at his client's form and be like, yeah, that's actually really bad, you know. And sometimes my own learning, it's like, yeah, do we want to triple the volume of a poorly done deadlift? Probably not. Yeah. Or an RDL or a squat or a bench press? Probably not. What if the reason why you're not progressing is because each one of your sets is not taken actually to the RPE you think it is, or you're just crushing yourself with too high of RPEs, and we don't actually need to increase volume. We need to first dial back the RPE on each set, and maybe then we'd be able to increase the volume without you feeling wrecked and not making progress. So I think it's really important to look at increasing the total throughput of the system, which is essentially volume, as a last effort you would make based on informed changes once you know that quality is there. Yeah. So first, like you look at what they're doing, does it work, and are they getting broken, and are they enjoying it? Okay, if they are progressing, they aren't getting broken, and things are all fine, okay, we don't change them, we make some tweaks here and there to optimize it. If things aren't working, well, first we need to figure out why. We can't just assume it's volume because that's been a hot topic of conversation. First, let me see your sets of your lifts. Tell me what the RP you think was on each one of those. And then once you've gone, okay, yeah, that was a similar RP to what I would gauge it, and that's a pretty solid movement pattern, and okay, you are pretty well recovered and you feel you can handle more, then we that's when you consider increasing volume, and do so in stepwise marginal fashions, like 10%, in my opinion, before changing anything else to actually make sure that actually did something. So
that's actually a really a really good topic to just almost expand on, because I think sometimes myself, I actually sometimes give our clients and would-be clients a little bit too much credit when it comes to form and quality, of the rep. But just as I was listening to Eric talk about that, I mean, I think about like one of Jeff Alberts' reps. They're probably twice as effective and have more volume than three of some of the reps that I see of some folks, on the social medias out there, And so does it really make sense to take that person who's doing three non-quality reps and double it to six, as opposed to maybe cutting that volume down and say, I want you to lighten up the load a little bit and make each one of those repetitions a lot higher quality. And, this can be expanded into not only, momentum and quality of the rep, but then range of motion. My son had a fascinating discovery the other day when he was comparing the size of his quads to one of his friend's quads in the weight room up at the high school. And Xander's quads were basically noticeably bigger than his friend, even though his friend squats a good 40 pounds more than Xander. And Xander, I guess intuitively, because of everything that I talk about here and that we talk about, said, well, of course you're squatting 40 pounds more than me. You're going half as deep. And so, of course, there, again, as Eric was talking, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, quality, of that rep. Sure, every time that kid squats, it's 40 pounds more, but he's losing probably anywhere between 4 and 6 inches on his range of motion. So one of Xander's reps at a deeper squat is probably going to be harder than two of the 40-pound heavier squats that are done at half of the range of motion. So, yeah, I think that's actually probably, if not the best caveat that we could talk about when it comes to volume. It's got to be one of the best.
Yeah, and then you have to consider too if that kid can't go. Like, then you have to consider first off, like, does that matter, right? Because if that kid doesn't have the flexibility to go as far down as Xander, then he should stay those extra 4 inches up, and it's okay that his load is higher because I guess then we measure more off RPE or the relative, or his hard sets would be at a heavier weight than Xander's, even though the movement quality of Xander's would be higher and they might be more effective for growing Xander's ass or whatever. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, that's another thing. It's like when people blindly follow, like, hey, you always have to squat to death. It's like, well, yeah, unless that makes your lumbar round and compress your spine at the bottom, then we probably don't do that, So, yeah, exactly. I think what a quality repetition looks like is going to be dependent upon the individual and their biomechanics and their abilities. But certainly, before you start to improve or increase quantity, you want to make sure that quality is what it should be within your capacity.
Yeah.
I was thinking about what my process is, because typically what I do is I actually start with a decrease in volume when I'm trying to figure out where someone needs to be. More often than not, people come to us with a little more than they need, or some redundancies, or just excess, Not always, certainly not always, but often. And I often strip things down to a kind of a bare bones upper lower and see if they progress and see for how long they progress. And then, yeah, sometimes we're limited by the fact that they just don't like it. Like, they want to be doing more, they want to be in the gym more, they want it to be harder. And that's when I encourage them to make those sets hard, and we give I started videotaping, and I just take their focus on other things that are useful, like the quality stuff we were talking about. Like, let's improve don't worry about getting in the gym 5 times. How about when you step in the gym, you actually do a proper movement? And let's see if we can, get your quality or your ability to hold yourself back or push yourself further, depending on, how your RPE matches up with what I think it is, in order. And then you can earn that volume increase if we're not progressing. But yeah, I think that makes a lot more sense than just starting from where they're at and increasing, because you don't know where they're at on the bell curve. They might be a Jeff Alberts who responds to a very low level of volume, and would be better served by a lower volume program until you try it.
Right. And I know when we're talking about that, like I know Brad has very detailed volume calculations within his spreadsheets for pretty much all athletes, most of your athletes. Is that
Yeah, we'll say
accurate?
most, not all of them.
Yeah, for
We'll
most
say
of
most,
them.
not all of them.
Okay. But if I don't have that built into my program, I guess, and like as a coach or as an athlete program for myself, do I need to know total tonnage per body part? Do I need to just track the movements that matter to me? Do I calculate for overlap even with hard sets? Do I, you know what I mean? So like if I'm like, I want to track this for me, and I'm a bodybuilder versus like, okay, I want to track this for me and I'm a power lifter.
Yeah, that's a funny question I get all the time.
Okay.
Do I count each set of bench
Right.
press for my triceps? And it doesn't matter because you're not comparing yourself to anyone else except you. So you can either say yes or no, and then you just need to assess whether or not it's appropriate as you manipulate it. Because it's kind of like whether or not you track your fiber or not. So long as it's relatively consistent and you are making changes relative to where you were, that's all that matters. You know, if you're always off by 10% on your calories, so what? When you stall, you'll still make a reduction. It doesn't matter that you're actually eating 10% more calories than you thought. So I typically, just to make it easy, every muscle group that's involved in a non-isometric manner in movement, I count it. You know, so if it's a squat or a leg press, I count that as, you know, quads and glutes primarily with a little bit of hamstring and lower back, you know, and if it's a pushing movement in a horizontal plane, that's chest, delts, and tris. Does it really matter that your triceps aren't probably getting as much stimulus as your chest? No. You know,
Unless it does.
It's something to look. Well, if
I'm a bodybuilder with really weak biceps, do my pull-ups count towards my
let's
bicep?
say all your form is great, right? And it's consistent.
Thanks.
And we want to
true.
And we yeah, and if you want to increase your biceps, thank you. If you want to increase your bicep size, you're probably not going to add rows and chin-ups anyway. You're probably going to add more direct work to your biceps. So either you didn't count your chins and your rows, and you're like, oh wow, my volume's really low, I should increase it, and that works. Or you did count it, and you go, I've already got a reasonably high volume, but I'm recovering fine, my elbows feel great, and my biceps aren't growing. Well, I probably should add some more curls. You know, so.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Good way to put it.
Yeah, it just needs to be consistent. Don't start changing the way you track volume over time. But I don't think for a bodybuilder especially there's any value in tracking tonnage, in my opinion.
Cool.
You could track strength progress and you could track number of sets, but I think it can have value and you can set it up that way. And I have sheets that track stuff like that. But for the average person listening, if you're going to track your own training, I don't think that's something you would need to do.
Gotcha.
It's certainly not the easiest way to do it or most intuitive.
Gotcha. And as a power lifter, do you prefer we just keep this on the big three? How many? I guess it depends what kind of accessories you need, if any. If like, is that right, Brad? Do you just track the big three or everything else?
Yeah, exactly. I typically just track the big three, you know, for a power lifter and relative changes over time in both volume, aka tonnage, and then intensity. And then a lot of times on accessories, I just usually track volume only, you know, and sometimes that's just counting repetitions. You know, it's sometimes amazes me how effective a prepping bodybuilder will be in retaining muscle, just tracking repetitions and auto-regulating load, you know. Sure, you know, and sometimes I find it fascinating, and I just track the numbers just more than anything, just for my own interest and my own learning. Mm-hmm. You'll see tonnages go down, you know, during a bodybuilding prep when a person's losing weight and leverages are changing, and you know all those things that suck about prep that we've talked about. Yet, you know, if you're tracking repetitions on that same sheet, sometimes repetitions will actually either stay the same or go up a little bit. and it's because they are auto-regulating load. And I'm telling them, I don't care what load you use. Let's just chase the reps that we're after here, whether it's 24 reps, whether that be 3 sets of 8, 4 sets of 6, whatever, and then auto-regulate the load. Well, even though their tonnages have gone down, their volume has actually kind of stayed the same as far as, like Eric said, 40 to 70 repetitions or what have you. So yeah, I think that it's probably worthwhile to not worry so much about the tonnages probably on your, even a bodybuilder, period. But certainly more so on your bodybuilding / isolation type exercise. It's probably just more important just to track through some quantifiable way of just hard sets, total repetitions, whatever.
Yeah.
I know different coaches vary on what they count as volume for the big three. Like some people will have like a squat, a pin squat, and then a high bar squat as they're doing within the same week, and they'll count all of that volume as squat volume, so they can compare it when they're doing a more specific 3 low bar squat sessions kind of thing. And I've seen some coaches who are on the other end of the spectrum. It's not a squat unless it's competition squat, And I think it probably makes sense to be a little more in that first example of really, really similar movement patterns and manipulations of the main lifts to assist them should probably be counted as volume, even though, of course, they're not super, super specific. They're going to stress the body in a similar way. So I would say, because volume is contributing both to stimulus and fatigue, right? And you would think it would be a pretty similar fatigue, even if the stimulus is a little different, doing a pin squat versus a squat for the most part. I mean, obviously there are some differences, but so yeah, I think you do have to think about what do you count as the lifts that you want to track tonnage on as a power lifter. But for the most part, I would agree with Brad. You probably want to track your volume a little more meticulously for a power lifter on the main movements. I think there's value in that because you really are just trying to see the actual weight you can lift go up, and there are 3 specific movements that are always going to be in there or a close variant.
Yeah, it's crazy because it's like everyone, I think we say everyone because I'm only in our little bubble of like a few thousand people in natural bodybuilding, but I think in that bubble, everyone like agrees, okay, volume matters for progress over time. And it's like this big thing that matters so much, and we should really pay attention to it and manipulate that over time, but at the same time, it can be so vastly complicated that it doesn't freaking matter. Or vice versa, like you can, like it can be really simple though too, right? Like if I was doing Wendler's 5-3-1, I could just do that for 5 years. It progresses on its own. Like I don't even worry about it, right?
Until it doesn't. Yeah.
But yeah, until it doesn't.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot of early on people that hear a lot of these podcasts or whatever, their first 2-3 years lifting, and they want to monitor it, but there's just so much that it's almost like it's kind of like the maintenance calories podcast too, where it's like, yeah, we need to track it. We want to be aware of where we are, but you'll never really know. Right.
Yeah. And sometimes I think it's almost as simple as, you know what? Just don't let it go down. Just don't let your volume go down a bunch, or if it does go down, don't make it last a full year, I mean, there's times where we go through periods of volume going down, but I think as long as that eventually comes back up again and maybe surpasses a little bit, that's really all that matters. So while you might have this peaks and valleys type of approach, if you make a mean line that, as long as that doesn't just keep trailing down and down and down and down and down and down, sometimes I think that's all that really matters. Is because I mean, I can't tell you how many athletes I've seen, and usually they're the outliers, don't get me wrong. They're the Jeff Alberts, the Jeff Nippards, the folks out there that are very, they're
responsive.
Just, exactly. Yeah. Sometimes I think that their volume really doesn't go up. Sometimes I look at them and they're just always doing the same thing, maybe just different exercises. And so the mean line has just got to be like this, and yet they're still progressing aesthetically, in their physique. And I guess I probably should digress a little bit because like you look at Jeff Nippard and that dude is still getting stronger. Because he is a power lifter. So even if everything else is staying the same and he's getting stronger than he actually is progressing, But yeah, I mean, sometimes I think it's just as easy as just try not to let your volume go drastically down over time.
And I would just say the caveat there is once you've found an appropriate volume level.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people have the question, hey, I was doing really high volume before, and I don't know if it's too much, but I'm worried if I go down, I'll lose muscle.
Yeah, you see that people panic.
Yeah, it's. I mean, like, on one hand, the fact that they're asking the question, they know this is not necessarily a logical thing to ask. Like, they're starting out with, I should probably be doing less volume, and the only reason they would do that is to grow more. But then they're also worried they're going to lose muscle mass. So, like, that's two different ideas that are conflicting in their brain.
Yeah, that just confused me. What? Oh,
Yeah,
so they think that
all the time,
decreasing
like,
volume would help their muscles grow because they just heard your recommendation and they're doing more than that? Is that why?
so for the first time, they get exposed to a recommendation that says do 10 to 20 sets per muscle group, and they look up and they're doing 30, and they think, oh, I should do what's optimal, but won't I lose muscle because I'm adapted to higher volume? And they kind of have this
Okay.
like short circuit, and it shows up as these panicked Instagram posts, So it's not a thing that if you're doing way more volume than you need to grow, that you become adapted to that, and now forever that's your set point, and you have to do more volume than you need to grow. It doesn't make any sense, right? Like let's say hypothetically you need 10 to 15 sets per muscle group, with all else being equal to grow maximally. If you're doing 30 and you're making any progress, A, that's awesome because you're somehow recovering. But B, the extra 15 sets is not making you grow any faster. So what is it doing? All it's doing is increasing your work capacity, which is not the same thing as your growth potential or your hypertrophy response. It just means like maybe you can replenish glycogen a little faster. You can use different fuel sources. Your heart rate doesn't get as high for multiple repeated sets, etc. But it's not important adaptations or necessary for growing as much as you can. And I've definitely seen multiple times starting someone, decreasing their volume, and they break a plateau and progress for years on 50 to 75% of the volume they used to do when they were kind of okay progressing or stalled.
And they were just
so I think that, yeah, and it was probably poorly organized as well. It wasn't a well set up plan. So it's a combination of
repetitions. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and I think we always
and God bless you, Eric.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, God bless Eric for kind of always taking me out of this place of like nirvana that I'm in, and putting it more real world. Because here I am thinking, yeah, just don't let your volume go down. Well, then I'm assuming that everybody's in nirvana and they're all happy, and they're not in pain, and they're not overtraining, and they are sleeping. And then, Eric's right. There's those people out there that are like, I've gotten to this point to where I'm always hurt, I'm always pain, but I can't let my volume go down because I'll shrink, and they're literally in a panic, and so, yeah, props to you, Eric, for taking me out of my little nirvana world and knowing that it's not always perfect.
Oh no, it's the one upside downside to having a lot of followers and being a purveyor of information is that you get to see consistent trends in panicking individuals.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You're supposed to save all of them, Eric.
I do my best.
All of them.
I'm doing my best right now to answer. If you're one of those people, you were just saved by the hand of Eric Helms today.
But I think we need to have both of those, right? Like if I'm neurotic and I'm freaking out all the time, maybe what Brad said was like, okay, that's all I need. That's all I need. Don't worry about anything else. Just go to the gym, So I don't think that it's that you were wrong or anything, Brad. It's just that, for the same goal, some people need to hear shit 100 different ways for 100 different people. So, and their worries might be different. Their insecurities might be different. Their hang-ups. So I don't think it was like not valid or anything. I'm just
No, I totally agree.
Yeah.
I think, a lot of the neurotic folks are always asking, but could I be progressing faster? And man, it's just not a useful question most of the time. Most of the time, that's just an attitude of that gets you hurt or ends up you spinning your wheels. Like once you've been in the game for years, you realize it's just about consistent progress, not did I make a lot of fast progress when I've been training 2.5 years? Like,
yeah.
You don't care anymore. Like, like unless you're planning on quitting weightlifting next month, it really doesn't matter if you make all the gains this month. And if you're at a very high level and you're like right on the cusp of being a world champion, even then, like let's say you decide to go on this uber crazy hard program, there's a high risk there. The reward is, yeah, you might be able to move up a ranking, and let's say you're fifth place at IPF Worlds, and you always get there, and you're trying to move up to the top three, and you're like, you know what, let's do 1/3 more volume this year because we got to do it. It's like, well, you could go from fifth to injured and not competing. So
Yeah.
if you're still progressing, you can outlast a lot of these fools. I told Bryce something in a meet he did in 2010. I said, the difference between a lot of good lifters and elite level lifters is who gets hurt. And I think one thing, Bryce is, don't get me wrong, he's a genetically gifted man, and he's a hard worker, and he's thoughtful, and he's very consistent and does a lot of things right. But one thing we've always done is taken a relatively conservative approach in the grand scheme of things, and he has never had a serious injury. Knock on wood. Thank you.
I don't know if this is what it's IKEA. It might not be real. I'm not sure what it's made of, but it made a noise.
Knock on carbon fiber. Yeah.
And I think what's comforting to me personally as a neurotic individual, something that always grounds me for those who need it or whatever, is that we have it easy. I say we as in like bodybuilders, physique carrying people. We have it easy, and we obsess about dumb shit over and over compared to every other sport. You know what I mean? Like I always have to bring it back to like when I was like push pull legs because my upper body's kind of weak, or upper lower. Like this is the decision of the year. You know what I mean? And then I'm like, wait, every other sport does full body every day. I think it's gonna be all right. I don't know.
Yep. Yeah, we have a lot of made up rules that that are just
make
cultural.
Shit up to count when it's like a lot of people don't count this. Like I don't know. There's things you can, and that doesn't mean like don't care. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's just that because there is no right answer, you could, like Eric, become a scientist and find it fun to play with these numbers. And Brad is a coach, even if they don't need it. I just like having the numbers because I want to see what's happening. And that's like a playful, useful way of examining things versus like, if I don't figure this out, I'm going to lose all my size and I'm not going to make it to stage next year and I'll never be a good power lifter and all that. Like, I think you've said this in a number of ways, Eric, but like the intent of why you're asking the question matters, or
Yes.
I think I said that wrong, but
Absolutely. Typically, when you are acting out of fear, or making decisions out of fear,
or panic,
or even when you're asking questions out of fear or panic,
yeah.
The questions aren't your best. You're not going to be able to trust the answers very well. Maybe the answers aren't quite as important for the thing you think they are at the time. They're often not going to be you're not going to look back and go, that was a good decision, like rarely, I very much agree. Like, you need to come from, your questions should be from a place of not having urgency and being able to see both sides of something and having a genuine curiosity and having a practical outcome that you can both test and even think through. Because if they're not, then they're more of these kind of panicky questions that you probably know the answer to, but that you don't like the answer in your head. Like if I could just ask you, well, what do you think? And you could answer it, but then you need reassurance. That's not really, reassurance is not the same thing as a genuine question, and that I get that all the time, and I get it. But at the same time, it's probably not the best use of your energy.
Yeah, and something when earlier when Brad said something about how the state in which we get people in, I was like, yeah, well, if we get someone that says, this is the program I do and I've been doing it for 6 months or a year, so then we know this amount of volume does whatever. I think we should say that almost, correct me if I'm wrong, that almost never happens. Usually if someone's coming to us for coaching, they were not following anything for very long. Like that scenario is rare that, like a lot of times, like you said, Eric, the first thing I'll do is drop it because they might be doing too much. But I also found, and a lot of times when I was taking a lot more athletes, that 9 times out of 10, if they gave me a program, they were doing it, they might have just started a month ago, or they needed to give me something, or they were just kind of guessing.
Yeah.
I'd
that's
say
really
that
common too.
I'd say that the former is getting more and more common myself, where you said that, such and such a person comes to us and they've been doing this program for 6 months, 8
You find
months,
that
whatever.
is happening?
It's becoming more and more frequent.
Good.
Yeah, more and more frequent. Yeah, and I think it's just, to be honest with you, that probably just the combination of pretty good quality coaches out there is making a dent, in the hordes of fitness populations, because you're right, Andrew. I mean, here, probably when we started doing Skypes like 10, 11 years ago, shoot, I found that people had changed their...
It was like 5.
What did I say? What did I say?
You said 10, 11 years ago. Maybe 2010, 2011. I'll give you that.
Oh, yes. You read my mind. You listen to what I meant and not what I said. But yes, 2010, 2011. Thank you. A lot of times I found that... Years ago. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Right, it's getting there. But yeah, I found that clients changed their program from the time that they put in their application until they met with us, like 3 weeks later, So yeah, I think that was very much the case a lot of the time, but it seems like it's still there. Don't get me wrong. We still have a lot of those clients, but it's at least refreshing to know that it's becoming less of the norm.
I think it's also very specific to whether or not someone comes through our Skype program or our contest prep initially. So like if someone comes up through contest prep, some things fall into place a little better. Like you're forced to follow something lower on the volume scale relative to what you can accomplish by the time you finish a season. And then we build back up from there. And you might hit a sweet spot earlier than you expected, which is kind of a cool thing. And always with a contest prepper, you're dealing with someone who is competing. So that means that there's a certain requisite level of care and attention and focus in their goals and the way they train. Not that we don't get some people who are super analytical and have been around for a long time who are competitors in the Skype program. It's not the requirement,
Yeah.
So yeah, I think when I think back to my Skypes in 2014, 2015, when I stopped doing them, yeah, that's where I would see a lot of the whole, I'll look at this training program, but we'll see what happens in 2 weeks when we actually sit down if that's still the way you're training, which is crazy to me that people would change things in a 2-week period, There's no way to tell anything.
Nutritionally, that happens all the time. Like Brad, we've talked about
Absolutely.
that. But yeah, training-wise, the fact that 2 weeks, yeah, it's a little bit crazy, but it happens.
Can't even get through a mesocycle, without changing something.
Yeah. Shoot. Sometimes we have tapers that last 2 weeks.
Yeah, exactly. So it's, but yeah, with the competitors who like want to do a Skype in the off season, more often than not, they're still doing something quite similar 3 months later, and that's when you can really start drilling down. But I think for most people, like, stop looking for what's optimal and just, because what I've noticed, like some people will spend all of their free time trying to figure out what's optimal, and they'll look at all these different sources and look at these programs and et cetera. And I always wonder, so you've been doing this for a year, looking at what you think is optimal. What has your training been like during that time period? Because I know each time you find something that convinces you it's optimal, you don't just stick with what you were doing. You're like, you know what, I'm just going to stick with 531 this year and just research for a year, and then next year I'll change it. Bullshit. Like you're changing it every time something strikes you, because the reason you're researching is because you're worried that you're not training as best as you could be. And in actuality, your search for optimal has led you to be doing completely program hopping nonsense for that full 52 weeks. So I think it takes time to look in the man in the mirror, as MJ would say, and kind of get real and just follow something for a while so you can actually get some baseline data.
We're just asking you to change your ways. That's all we're doing.
Yeah.
I did it, Eric. I pulled it, Eric.
Yeah.
I pulled it, Eric. He usually does that. Okay, so when someone says, how do I know if I'm a Jeff, a Berto, or a Doug Miller, as in that Instagram post? Bad question?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think, but you would need to. Well, I mean, it's important. So, like, I'll give a real world example. In 2010, I went and trained with Jeff 3 days a week. Just drove down. He was 40 minutes away from me without traffic when I was living in Sacramento. Trained him 3 days a week on a rotating upper lower. I remember I had a PB on RDL. My leg training was going great, but I could visibly see my upper body getting smaller, and my military press was just ticking down, as was my bench when I trained with him. And he was making great progress. So like that's a thing, you know. Like, not only did I notice that my body parts responded differently, but that I responded differently in aggregate from Jeff. And the first time I really started to get great upper body progress was when I started doing every other day upper lower, and then benching all the damn time. So like, but I mean, that took me. I started training in 2004, so it's a long time to figure that out. And I think it's because I didn't pay attention in the same way that we advise people to now. So I would probably do something like strip it down to a bare bones upper lower. One compound per muscle group with a little bit of extra stuff, 3 sets per movement, where you're just barely reaching those kind of meta-analytic guidelines, and just see how it goes for a while. If you came from a high volume background, worst case scenario, you're going to make progress for a few weeks because it's basically a deload, and you're going to be able to go heavier. So you're going to have a nice little high intensity block thing, and then it'll peter off, and you'll be like, this has been really easy the entire 4 to 6 weeks. I know I need more. Great, you can always add more. But if you start with, you know what, we'll see if I respond really well to ultra high volume. I'm just going to do small off for squats, deadlifts, and bench and see how it goes. Well, the way you find out you're wrong is you break. Like that's of those two options, it's pretty obvious what you should do first. And the only thing that would stop you is being worried that for a period of 6 weeks you might not be making optimal gains, which is a really, really short-term, ridiculous view if you plan on lifting for 10 to 20 years of your life.
Yeah, that tends to fix most things, huh? All the panics is like, what's the worst that could happen? Like that, yeah, we see that more often in nutrition when it's like, should I bulk? Will it help my training? It's like, so eat more for a couple weeks. It's not a big deal. Something we touched on but didn't go into, I forget which one else said it. I think Brad did, about how you don't think like Jeff's training volume maybe he's not here to speak for himself, has really jumped up in the last 10 years or whatever, but his physique, even this late in the game, still progresses over time. I guess if I'm...
It did jump up. It did jump up in I would say maybe 2011 or so.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was actually coincided with when he made some significant progress. I think it had a lot more to do with holding on to muscle, because he was doing, like, he went from basically, there was a point in 2009 he was training like twice a week. Part of that was due to injury, but
and he also like Jess says, he held on to muscle better because he was competing like in the, I think, mid 150s in 2009, 2008, 2007 to competing in the mid to high 160s.
Yeah. When
he got fourth at Worlds in 2014. So holding on to significantly more muscle.
Yeah, he was coming into shows pretty flat, and looking depleted and a lot more stringy. Like, I was able to stand on stage with him in 2009, and I didn't look like I was getting dwarfed, which is not the way it is now.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at, though, is that if you looked at his program on paper, did it jump up in volume, but his physique looked better?
I would say it did jump up in volume. It
Okay.
went from really low to on the low end of moderate,
Okay.
around say 2011, and now it's largely, not to speak for you, Jeff. I'm sure you're going to hear this and going to get something wrong, but for the most part now it seems like Jeff moderates his volume based on pain and aches and pains and issues around that, which is kind of the reality of lifting in your 30s and later, I would say.
Well, and two, you have, in my opinion, his, regardless of the load, his rep quality is really good.
Yeah.
And like we were talking about how volume can sometimes not be quantified, almost in rep quality.
Yeah.
I'd say he gets a lot of volume in every repetition that he does, regardless of what that load is. So even if he has been flat for, like, say, the last 3 or 4 years quantifiably as volume goes, when he did make that initial jump and made those tremendous physique gains, it's comfortably stayed there, through the different methods that he's managed to, to kind of formulate.
Yeah.
At least that would be like, yeah.
No, he gets a lot of engagement. He hits the target muscle very effectively. His RPEs are appropriate for his training volume and frequency, meaning they're pretty high. And I think, he trains in a very effective way. And it makes sense because he came from, at a certain point in his career, he bought into the more high intensity mentality, and that very much emphasizes quality over quantity. So I think that experience probably makes it so that now, if you give him a lot of volume, it will really beat him up because he only knows how to train effectively, so he does a lot more with less than your average bodybuilder, I would say.
Right. Would it be crazy to, in this conversation, include things like if I was to do BFR curls to save my biceps, or like if I, you know what I mean? Like there's
Absolutely.
Okay. Like things that you could go down this rabbit hole forever.
Yeah. There are certain movements which really allow you to get more volume, which is where I think there is some weakness in some of our more power buildery, more global kind of unified strength sport, bodybuilding sport approach that sometimes get lost. I've gone through periods where just because I like to, every movement I do involves a barbell, or a chin-up bar, which is basically, barbell attached to a wall. And while that's cool and all, and while that gets me excited and that's the way I like to train, in my experience now, having dealt with like a hip injury and had to work around a few other things here and there, dude, you can go hog wild. If most of your movements are like cables, you can get a ton of volume in that doesn't stress anything. If you're doing, single, like movements that you allow your arms and legs to move independently, so many of the issues that come from barbell training that force you into certain positions and may not, like a barbell doesn't care if one of your legs is a centimeter longer than the other, what I'm saying? Barbell doesn't care if you had an injury to your clavicle when you were skiing when you were 14, and but dumbbells, cables, they definitely can allow you to work around some of that stuff. And I think that's why sometimes you get different perspectives on volume. Like if you tell a powerlifter to do 20 hard sets on each one of their movements, they're going to be like, you're out of your goddamn mind. Like, I'm going to die. Yeah. But if you tell that to a bodybuilder, they go, well, sure, yeah, I could bump it up to, like, let's say I do leg press, leg extension, hack squats, and then, front squats, and I could do 5 sets on each one of those per week. That wouldn't be too crazy on 2 different lower body days. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's not out of this world, so it's very different. So I think it's useful to understand that perspective from a hypertrophy vantage point, that, yeah, you want to have a solid basic proficiency with the compound lifts because they are so effective per unit of volume. But that's also the reason why you can't just use them unless you're just perfectly built for those exercises and your spine's super robust and all that stuff,
Yeah. Man, lots to consider, because then it makes me think about like how how long it takes me to warm up to do snatches, which is half my back squat weight, an extra 15 minutes of movement preparedness. You know what I mean? Like, is that worth it for for a lot of people? No. Whereas I could probably leg press within where I could leg press within 5 minutes of walking in versus like, all right, I have to do snatches and overhead squats, or like it's just a lot of things.
The same thing's true for squats and a powerlifter. Sometimes it'll take them 30 minutes before they do their first working set.
I was gonna say shit. I've lifted with LS before, and that takes all day really to get through squats.
A combination of being incredibly strong and also because you have to squat a lot, you're going to have some banged up something, But yeah, for me, like sometimes I feel like I'm like on cable row when I come in, like I just benched, right? And then I'm going to do cable row. And I convinced myself to do a warm-up set, But I would never jump into a working set on bench. Like, just slap 120 on there, see if I can get 10. Like, that's not going to go well,
Well, and then people ask, well, do you calculate that within your volume, or do you not start until?
It's the beauty of hard sets.
That's true. Yeah.
The ones shouldn't be hard. If they aren't, then you're not warming up well.
Seminal article on hard sets for listeners.
Yeah, that's on. I would check out Stronger by Science. It's on. That was written on Greg's website.
Yeah, he has a couple really good ones on there, actually.
Yeah, Greg writes a whole.
Yeah, well, he had a guest article with some. I don't know the guy's name. I feel bad. But Greg has a couple good ones. But then he had a guest article that was like really long.
You talking about hard sets?
Not just hard sets, just like a new, like a comparing and contrasting the different ways that you could calculate volume. And I guess what makes me happy about it too is like, I'll spoiler alert it, is that there is no way to do it. There's not a right way. That there's, it'll probably change. Here, I think, these ones tend to make more sense for a bodybuilder, whatever that is, a powerlifter versus a powerlifter versus a bodybuilder, right? And like strength versus hypertrophy. I think in one of his articles you mentioned
I think the article is by Nathan Jones.
What's the title?
The New Approach to Training Volume.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. So shout out to Nathan Jones. Check out Stronger by Science. And I think Greg wrote a follow-up article about some counting training volume. Yeah, maybe.
Something. There's a lot of them on that site, so.
Yeah. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, but and then there's a learning curve on like you said, what is a hard set? Do you know what that really feels like once movement quality is there? Like, so takeaways for listeners. You'll never, like, same as maintenance calories. I feel like it's a similar thing. Like we say you need a baseline, but like it's not real or forever.
Yeah, you were probably lifting before you heard this podcast, just like you were probably eating food before you listened to our maintenance calories podcast. Yeah. So yeah, I'd say for most of the time, if you are following some type of structured approach, you're making good progress, and you're not constantly injured or dreading going to the gym and feeling beat up all the time. You're probably okay. Maybe just stick with it. If you are relatively new to lifting and you want to kind of figure out what's an appropriate baseline, I would probably start with like 10 sets per muscle group, training at least twice per week, and then only change once you can't progress your loads, because that's basically the tester of whether this works or not. And then for people who are in the stratosphere of volume and are feeling the negative effects and aren't progressing, maybe try dropping back to there and seeing just how high you need to go if you do stall on just doing 10 sets per week for now. And yeah.
And then
that's the main training.
Yeah. And when you say seeing if you're progressing or not, beginners session to session, then it'll go week to week. Then at some point you should be looking mesocycles. Then you don't need this conversation because you're good enough to have something complicated enough and someone's calculating this for you on a big level. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. If you're at the point where you're only progressing like every 3 mesocycles, and you're not incredibly weak or small,
yeah.
then,
Then you get it.
That's probably, yeah, you're doing it right already. So, yeah.
Okay. Brad, anything to add there?
Just to expand on kind of what Eric said is that just kind of keep in mind the unquantifiable volume, the rep quality, like we talked about with Jeff. Arguably maybe tonnages have gone down with him, but because his reps are so effective now, he's more than offset for that to make up for that volume. Just little things like that. Don't be afraid to take your volume down if it means better quality training. You're probably going to end up better off in the long run. You're probably not only going to be stronger, but your physique is probably going to show those things too. Because when you talk about those unquantifiable things, volume is almost like this mysterious mist, this movable, target that, you have to, I don't know, it's almost like you have to know, like we said, you have to know where you've been in order to figure out what's worked and what's not working and why it's working and why it's not.
And you can see that in some very, very high-level powerlifters too. Like their absolute loads are so high that there is pain, risk, and just metabolic fatigue. Like doing a set of 5 that's hard when you can squat 800 pounds is wow. Like shit, I have to squat. Do I really have to squat like 600 for 5 right now? That's not going to be fun, And you'll see at the high level powerlifters volumes start to go down a little bit as their absolute loads get astronomical, and they work with the least amount they can do to progress because it's very, very taxing and also highly specific. And there's a certain point where the absolute load is going to matter a little more than the relative load, and we see that super heavies are typically doing a little less volume than volume tends to scale with weight class the other way when you're looking at relative volume, but scales the other way when you're looking at absolute tonnage. So
very cool.
Yeah.
And then,
that is actually kind of an interesting point because like I think about last night's training session, I essentially did a single, a double, and another single, and those were 4 hard sets.
Yeah.
It was a single, that was a hard set. It was a double, that was an even harder set, and then it was another single that was an even harder set. So you look at 4 total repetitions, they may not look like very much volume. So that's actually a fascinating point too.
Yeah, comparing the peaking block of a powerlifter like you're in to the high level powerlifter too, or an experienced powerlifter I should say, to like a second year bodybuilder going, well, I did more sets on an incline preacher curls and cable crossovers than that. It's not the same thing, dude. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys for chatting. I feel like that was useful.
Good.
If you don't think so, don't comment. Just kidding. But if you do,
we don't
let us know.
Only tell us good things.
Talk to you later.
Hey everybody, it's Eric Helms. Thanks for tuning into our podcast. As you know, at 3DMJ we promote evidence-based approaches to the lifting community. If that's something you want to dive deeper into, I'd encourage you to check out my research review, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport, or for short, MASS. This is a review that myself, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Greg Knuckles put out every month. We cover the latest research publications that are applicable to strength and physique athletes, or anyone who's looking to get stronger or improve their body comp. Our content is in both written and video format. For more information on how to subscribe, check out 3dmusclejourney.com/mass. That's 3dmusclejourney.com/MASS for further details. Thanks for tuning in.